Hello and welcome to Nothing Worth Saying. Today I am talking all things political participation with my former A-level politics lecturer and the person responsible for getting me into politics, Tom Featherstone. Hope you enjoy. So Tom, how important do you believe political participation is?
I think it's really important in a representative democracy. Our idea about the legitimacy of the government comes from the people supporting that government, backing that government. And if the turnout is very low in a general election, for example, that is going to lead us to question the legitimacy of the government, whether it's as legitimate as a government backed by a much bigger turnout, and the mandate of that government. And then I guess secondly, I think participation tends to bring with it educational benefits. People will often do a little bit of research and learn about some of the issues as they go to participate, at least in some way. If they're not even inclined to participate, then they're not going to get those educational benefits either.
Yeah, I think Alexis de Tocqueville, I probably butchered that, but he said the more people who participate in the democracy, the more democratic it becomes. And also there was this Ellis study recently, which measures the quality of government and shows that nations with a higher overall political participation have better performing government. So that sort of solidifies your point. So moving on. Across Western democracies, voter turnout and trust in politics has decreased since the 1950s. The proportion of people who trust the government to put the needs of the nation first has decreased from 38% in 1986 to 17% in 2013. And it's probably gone down since. Membership of political parties has also decreased in the last 6 decades. So taking all this into consideration, do you feel we are currently undergoing a participation crisis?
I think there's a participation problem. I think the word crisis is too strong. I think it's interesting you make a contrast in turnout between the 1950s and now. A couple of reasons. First of all, yes, turnout in the 1950-51 general election was unbelievably high, but you have to remember that this was the context of just after World War II. People at the time, I think, felt a certain duty to engage democratically in the government, having just fought for those democratic rights and so on. If you go back to say the 30s, turnout actually wasn't as high as it was in the 50s. Secondly, if you look at turnout in the UK, it's improving. So we were at a 69% turnout in the last general election. Referendum turnout's been pretty decent for some of the major referendums, at least. The EU referendum, 72%, the Scottish independence referendum, 85%, I think. I know 69% isn't where we'd like it to be. I know that means there's still virtually a third of people that aren't voting. So is there a problem? Absolutely. Is it a crisis? No. But we've got to make sure it doesn't become one.
Okay. Well, one thing there is definitely a discrepancy in is political inequality, for instance, between voters. And that's something that's rife in the UK. And in this discussion, I want to focus purely on political inequality between younger and older voters.
Sure.
Although there are obviously many other social cleavages that affect voting behaviour. So evidence from a plethora of sources have shown young people to be less likely than other age groups to participate in political activities, to be on the electoral register and to vote. For instance, estimated turnout of the 2017 election was lower among young people, with just 43% of 18 to 24-year-olds voting, compared with 82% of people in the 65-74 and 75 to 84 age brackets. Yeah. So if somebody deals with young people and their relationship to politics daily, how do we get more young people participating in politics?
Well, I actually think we've allowed this to happen. When I ask my students what political education they had before starting their A-level in politics, the answer is very, very little. They'll say none, typically. I think the answer is probably a little bit more than that, but it really is very little. And one of the very few things my students agree on, they're politically very diverse, but one of the things they almost all agree on is that students in schools need to be taught the basics of politics. This doesn't have to be a full GCSE, but it does have to be just the absolute basics of things like how to vote, when you vote, what happens to those votes, what a government is, what Parliament does. Just a few lessons on these topics would go a long way, and it gets a lot further than where I think most of our young people are right now. A few years ago I did a survey about politics students and asked them why did they choose A-level politics. And the number one answer wasn't because I know lots about it and I want to develop that. It was because I know nothing about politics and I feel like I should. Now that's a wonderful, honourable thing to say. But at peak, 5 to 10% of students are choosing A-level politics. That means 90 to 95% of A-level students aren't doing it. So we are allowing as a country the vast majority of our students to leave education with a very, very poor understanding of politics. Now, that's a choice we're making, and I think it's the wrong choice. And I think that is going to be one of the major effects, not the only one, one of the major causes of the participation problems, in fact, actually may be crisis when we're talking about young people, in young people's participation. I think if you're looking for kind of reasons why young people don't participate, although some do, that would be big. Another would be what you might call sort of vicious cycle. I think because young people often don't participate, there is completely understandably an inclination on the part of many politicians to, ignore would be too strong a word, but to be conscious that those votes are less likely to be available than the votes of older people. So the not voting might lead to those young people being less listened to, which is likely to create more disillusionment and therefore them not voting.
Yeah.
And the vicious cycle whips around and around. Now, whenever you've got a vicious cycle, you then have to think, how do we unpick that? Because vicious cycles can become virtuous cycles. If we could just get to a situation where either young people make the first move and start voting, then they will have to be listened to. And you saw a little bit of that in 2017. Or where politicians start making the big steps towards young people in a more genuine way. Politicians always say that they intend to, but really doing that in a big, big way, in which case just maybe that would bring in young people.
Yeah.
But we have to turn that vicious cycle into what you might call a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, I think there's this report from the IPPR, and they did a report on political inequality, and they show that political parties, as you were saying, target their communications at people who are more likely to vote, and non-voters worse off than voters, judging from the 2010 spending review.
Sure.
So, again, that links to exactly what you were saying. I also think, from my point of view, the campaigns to get young people voting are not effective at all. I think you had the recent Rise Up campaign, where you had Brian May and UB40 going out and telling the young people to vote. As in, that's what my parents' age group listen to that sort of stuff.
Sure.
There's this guy also called Michael Brutter, and he said we should try and get voters excited about voting for the first time. So he did a study in countries to make it more of a ceremony. For instance, sending a letter around to say, you're invited to vote in the election, this is your first time. Try and make it seem like a big deal, because it really is a big deal, because as we saw from that report, if you don't vote, you don't get a say in politics. Yeah. There's also the slight thing about the 16 to 18-year-olds vote. I think in the Scottish referendum, 75% of 16 to 18-year-olds voted, whereas the 18-year-olds who are often at uni and a gap year down the pub just aren't interested in voting. So although there's pros and cons to that, perhaps that could help.
I'm sure it doesn't apply to you personally,
Ellis.
Oh,
no, of course not. So citizenship studies was introduced in 2002, but
from what I've seen, the take-up in real terms is not what it was meant to be.
Yeah, it wasn't even an option at my school.
And I think, it's hard to blame schools for that, because I think they have an incredibly crowded curriculum. They're under enormous pressures to get their GCSEs in a good place. It doesn't appear that requirement is particularly robustly enforced. So with the best will in the world, if schools can quietly drop that, they are and they will.
Yeah. You've been a teacher in schools. So what sort of methods do you use to engage young people in politics, for instance, here at QMC and your colleges and elsewhere?
I've got to be honest, when you have a bit of time to do some politics with students, engaging them actually isn't terribly difficult. So you want to show the students how it affects them. Well, that's not actually hard to do. It so obviously does. The topic we talk about right now is the European Union and Brexit. Well, you can so instantly and so easily show young people how that, they already know that has a massive impact on them, and talk through that and play that through with them. And then politics is just so intrinsically interesting as well. It's about stories, and we all like stories. It's about personalities and people, and we're all intrigued by those as well. In terms of what I do personally, I'm a big fan of role play. I tend to get my students, you might remember Ellis, doing mock parliaments and mock cabinets, and we do a select committee role play these days, which probably has come in since your time here. So I think when you get people involved, look, it's back to our participation point. When you get people taking part and throwing themselves into it, they learn, they care more, they have a good time, because politics is fun and funny, and serious as well, and I think they develop a love of it. But what we need, I think, is with the vast majority of young people who aren't doing any serious politics, at least a few lessons of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I thought one thing you did that helped me out was that there was that booklet where we had to fill in the news each, and that really helped me sort of know what's going on with the world. Because before I really took politics with you, I didn't really have a clue about what was happening. So I thought that was one thing that helped.
Gotcha. It's good to hear. We've just brought it back again. So
really?
It's really good to hear.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on more people moving towards more informal forms of political participation? And what do you think this means for the more traditional forms of political participation?
Yeah, I'm speculating here, okay. There is a big chat which says there's been a shift from formal to informal. That people are less inclined to vote or join political parties, and instead they're doing this informal participation stuff, signing petitions and going on marches and whatnot. Yeah, there might be a bit of that, but I suspect it's not A instead of B. I suspect it's both. I suspect those people who are signing the petitions, are on the marches, are often also voting. I don't necessarily buy into the idea that these people are non-voters, for example. They might not be members of political parties. I might go that far with you, but non-voters, I'm not sure I buy that. They might be voting in some cases, for the less established parties. You can imagine somebody that's the Leave campaign from voting for the Brexit Party. You can imagine some, but I still suspect these people are politically engaged and they are participating in formal and informal ways. I think it comes back to what we talked about at the start, which is the bigger problem is the large group of people who are just not politically engaged at all, whether it's formal or informally. And I think that, for me, is the deeper problem we've got to come back to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's another sign of political inequality in the sense that the people often who are going out on these marches are the wealthy individuals or a lot wealthier or a lot more engaged than the people who aren't. So it just, again, it reinforces that divide between voters, really, or voters and non-voters. So the use of technology has increased drastically in recent years. What effect do you think this currently has on politics, and how could it shape the way politics is conducted in the future?
It's starting to have an impact, isn't it? Petitions is probably the one that comes straight to mind. If you think about the Westminster official e-petitions site, that's become huge. We've had some very famous, very striking and well-backed petitions, most recently regarding Brexit. I think now, between general elections, that website is the single biggest way that the public are engaging with Parliament. It's not coming to visit and watch debates, it's not coming to lobby their MP in person. It's signing that e-petitions website. So it has become, I guess, a big deal in terms of inputs. What I wonder is whether the people that sign those petitions realise that the debate that it triggers is a debate in Westminster Hall, not the main chamber, in most cases.
Yeah.
Westminster Hall is a sparsely turned out attended venue. You might have there, 10 MPs, I'm guessing, something in that region, maybe a few more. Funny enough, I gather the audience in those Westminster Hall events is very big. Lots of people then want to turn up and watch those Westminster Hall debates that were triggered by the petition.
Yeah.
But actually MPs, their time is spent more often in the main chamber and so on. And don't forget that what happens in Westminster Hall, it might count as scrutiny, but it doesn't count as legislation. It has no legislative impact. So to your second question about the way forward, I guess we might consider, this isn't about the UK becoming a direct democracy, but staying within that representative democracy framework, whether we could give the e-petitions a bigger role within Parliament. As people more and more invest their time in signing these petitions, maybe it could more often feature in the main House of Commons chamber. Maybe it could have more of a role in the legislative process. Although ultimately, with MPs having their role also. No, I mean, that's very broad brushed. I'm not giving you a specific of how to do it, but I think I would imagine something like that is likely to happen in the decades ahead.
Yeah, I think the issue with that e-petition, for instance, 6 million people signed that revocable Article 51, and the government just threw it out, basically. Sure. But it has helped in some cases. For instance, in Hillsborough, I think it got that back on the agenda and led to the release of documents for that. I did want to ask you a point about social media quickly, because that seems to have become a big thing in politics, and it's all the rage these days. What effect do you think that's sort of having on politics?
I suppose a mixed effects, like any media does. So let's just take away social for a second. Let's just think about the print media. If we didn't have it, well, that would be disastrous. Governments would be unchecked in a range of ways. The public would be uneducated in a range of ways. So it's good that we have the media, but there are clearly issues with the media. There's issues around media bias and so on. I think you get exactly the same mixed picture with social media. So yes, it's good in that it allows for political engagement in various ways. It gives lots of people a voice, and that has to be democratically a good thing. On the other hand, there are many, many issues regarding misinformation being spread around. And for me, as somebody working with young people, an issue that I would worry about would be some of the nastiness one gets on social media. It appears to me that death threats have become ubiquitous in politics now. You know, what MP hasn't now received death threats? Now, if you went back a few decades, were MPs routinely getting death threats? You know, that sort of thing I think alarms me, very, very, very much. So, impact, yes, it's had a big impact, some of which is good and some of which is not.
Well, Pew Research shows people who use social networking sites are particularly likely to take political action. So that's obviously a good thing in boosting participation. The main issue with it, I think, is the ecosphere, in the sense you follow the group that you like, and all the news you're seeing on that is purely one-sided to that side. So, and that, I think, creates a massive divide in politics, because if people are getting their news from elsewhere, and I guess it did happen in the past, but...
I was going to ask you that. Do you think it was any different in the days when you would choose a newspaper to read? You would choose to read The Sun or The Guardian or whatever?
I guess, but then people still often watch the news at 10 to get sort of like both sides of it, whereas these days it's a lot of people just aren't turning away from mainstream news and TV and just looking at their Twitter timeline and seeing all the stuff from there.
I see.
I do think technology has had a positive impact in some ways. Like, it's increased the availability of public sector data, which is the freedom of information request. I think they're all online. Yeah. And the use of public consultation and public access to and speed of communication with decision makers. There's still a long way to go, but it's also had drawbacks. For instance, a lot of fake news is online. There's hacktivism that has increased in recent years. For instance, breaking into computer systems for socially motivated purposes. I guess with WikiLeaks, you could say, as part of that. It's benefits and drawbacks, isn't it?
Right.
At the end of the day, we don't know how it will affect things in the future. I guess we shall see.
Are you optimistic, Ellis? Are you optimistic about the future of participation in this country?
I think changes need to happen. Turnout going up is a good thing, but then a lot of people forget how bad that 2001 election was. As in, I wasn't around, but it was almost a foregone conclusion, so people won't vote in that. I think the main thing, is education. You need to get people realising how much their vote means, because at the minute people think their vote doesn't matter or the vote doesn't count when it really does.
But if it's education, then I'm not yet optimistic. You know, that Crick report you alluded to earlier, 2002, we're now 2019, that's 17 years ago. And I think I've seen in that time no discernible difference in political education for the vast majority of young people. If that's what we're pinning our hopes on, that I'm seeing so far, no serious evidence. It's
as I said earlier, the people report, like, on political education statistics, young people are often know the least about it, and your first time voting is often, I think there's statistics, so if you vote in the first election of your life, you're more likely to vote in the second, third, fourth. If you don't, you won't. If you don't, you won't, and you've got a large proportion of people who are not. So maybe it doesn't bode well for that sort of turnout in the future.
Now, don't quote me on this, although I know it's a podcast, so that's the point. But I gather that there's a country, and I forget which one, who makes voting compulsory for the first time you're eligible to vote. I can't remember if it was a country that does it or it's a proposal. It may be a proposal. But it's to try and deal with the exact issue you've just raised. Yeah. That's a thought.
Yeah, it could work. My only issue with compulsory voting is stuff like people just spoiling ballots. Like, I think there was cases in the 90s in Argentina where people were just turning up, ticking a random box and then just leaving because they had to. Sure. But I think, as that Brutta report said, you've got to try and encourage young people to vote. If it's by sending them a letter saying you need to vote, or I think there was a Sky News thing that said voting online, 5 in 6, I think actually 4 in 5 are more likely to vote online. So maybe that's a potential for the future, try and get the young people engaged. Another thing I picked up on just researching for this was young people often like big ideas. For instance, the Barack Obama 2008 election, he had this ideas for the future, and youth turnout was higher than before. Same, arguably, to a lesser extent with Corbyn in this election. I think the main one was Bernie Sanders, which the primary candidacy of him, which assured for the first time millennial voters formed as large a voting bloc as baby boomers.
Right.
So, this guy, Brutta, who's a professor at Ellis, he says that you need to get people engage with big ideas for the future, and not just give them cheap handouts like tuition fees or something like that, because that's not going to get the youth voting, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. It kind of did, though, a bit. I feel like Corbyn did get a bit of a youth vote bonus with his tuition fees policy. But perhaps you're right, perhaps it has to do both, and both would take it further.
Yeah, I guess we shall see what happens in the future. Anyway, thank you, Tom, for joining me on this podcast.
It's been a real pleasure. It's really good to see you again.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Cheers.